The town of Red Hollow had always been the kind of place where legends were born from dust, whiskey, and whispered wagers, but none had stirred the people quite like the challenge nailed to the swinging doors of the Rusted Spur Saloon one blazing summer afternoon. The paper, yellowed but freshly inked, bore bold words that caught every eye that passed through the street. "If you're a real cowboy, ride my stallion." Beneath the proclamation was a signature that made even hardened outlaws draw a careful breath. Eleanor Voss, the widow of Black Ridge. For 3 years since her husband's mysterious death, beneath the hooves of the same monstrous stallion, Eleanor had lived in the sprawling Voss Ranch house overlooking the canyon. She was known not only for her beauty, which many described in reverent tones, but also for her cold, commanding presence that could silence rooms faster than a drawn revolver. Rumors claimed the stallion, Midnight Tyrant, was cursed untamable and smarter than most men who dared approach him. 25 cowboys had already accepted her challenge, each convinced that skill, courage, or arrogance would carry them through. And every one of them had failed, some with broken ribs, others with shattered pride, and a few who left town before dawn, unwilling to speak of what they had endured. The saloon buzzed as men gathered around the poster, their hats tipped low as they debated whether the challenge was madness or opportunity. The bartender, Gus, wiped a glass with a rag as old as his patience and shook his head slowly whenever someone spoke too boldly. He had seen each attempt, watched wagons carry battered men back from the Voss Ranch, and listened to Eleanor's calm, unwavering declaration after every failure. She never mocked them, never smiled, simply dismissed them with a nod and returned to her balcony, where she watched the storm clouds roll over her land like a queen guarding a kingdom no one dared invade. It was said she offered a reward beyond gold, though no one could agree what that reward truly was. Some whispered she promised half her ranch. Others insisted she sought a husband strong enough to claim her heart. Most believed she was merely trying to destroy men foolish enough to challenge her grief. Late one evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon and dust swirled through the narrow streets, a lone rider approached Red Hollow. His horse was lean but steady, its coat marked by long travel and quiet endurance. The rider himself wore a weathered coat that had seen too many storms to count, and his hat shadowed a face carved by solitude rather than age. His name was Caleb Rourke, though no one in Red Hollow recognized him. He dismounted outside the Rusted Spur, tying his horse with a gentleness that spoke of habit rather than show. Inside, conversations paused as he entered, the creak of the saloon doors announcing him like a challenge of its own. He stepped toward the bar, ordered black coffee instead of whiskey, and listened to the stories swirling around him. When someone mentioned the widow's stallion, Caleb's eyes flickered with interest, though his expression remained steady as desert stone. Gus eyed him carefully before nodding toward the poster pinned to a wooden pillar. "You here for that madness too?" he asked, his voice roughened by years of smoke and secrets. Caleb took his time finishing the coffee before standing and walking toward the notice. He read every word slowly, as though measuring the weight of each letter. The room watched him in silence, men shifting uneasily as if sensing something unfamiliar about this stranger. He did not boast or laugh like the others who had come before. Instead, he folded the paper carefully after reading it, then placed it back against the wood, smoothing its edges as though respecting its warning. When he turned back toward the bar, he asked only one question: "Where's the Voss Ranch?" The simplicity of his tone unsettled the room more than any declaration of bravery could have. The ride to the Voss Ranch was longer than most expected, stretching across plains that seemed to swallow sound and thought alike. Caleb traveled at a steady pace, his mind drifting through memories he rarely allowed himself to revisit. He had spent years drifting from town to town, avoiding routes, avoiding attachments, and most of all avoiding the ghosts that rode beside him whenever the night grew too quiet. The name Midnight Tyrant lingered in his thoughts, not as a threat but as a puzzle, and puzzles were something Caleb could never ignore. When the ranch finally rose against the horizon, it appeared less like a home and more like a fortress carved into the wilderness. Tall fences lined the sprawling land, and beyond them, silhouettes of horses galloped like shadows beneath a sky heavy with gathering clouds. Eleanor Voss stood on the veranda as Caleb approached, her black dress stirring gently in the wind like a morning flag that refused to lower. She watched him dismount with a gaze sharp enough to strip illusions from a man's soul. Up close, she was even more striking than the rumors suggested. Her beauty carried no softness, only a sculpted elegance shaped by loss and iron determination. Caleb removed his hat respectfully as he stepped forward, and for a moment neither spoke, the silence stretching between them like a duel waiting for the first move. Finally, Eleanor broke it with a voice calm enough to hide the storms behind it. "You've come for the challenge," she said, not as a question but as a verdict already decided. Caleb nodded once. "I've come to meet the horse." The answer made her eyebrows lift slightly, as if she had expected bravado or desperation rather than quiet certainty. She gestured toward the far paddock where a massive black stallion circled like a storm contained within muscle and fury. Midnight Tyrant was larger than Caleb imagined, his mane whipping through the air as he slammed his hooves against the ground, sending dust spiraling upward in violent bursts. The animal's eyes glowed with a wild intelligence that seemed almost human, and the scars lining his flank told stories of past battles against ropes, fences, and perhaps men who underestimated him. Eleanor watched Caleb's reaction carefully, waiting for the flicker of doubt she had learned to recognize in every challenger. It never came. Instead, Caleb studied the stallion as though observing an old rival rather than a beast. "He's not cursed," he murmured. "He's angry." Eleanor stiffened at the remark, her gaze narrowing. "You speak as if you understand him," she replied. Caleb shrugged slightly. "I've seen anger like that before. It doesn't come from nowhere." The widow's expression faltered for the briefest moment, a crack in her composure so small most men would have missed it. She turned away quickly, signaling a ranch hand to open the paddock gate. "You'll ride him at sunrise," she declared. "That gives you the night to reconsider, or pray, depending on which you believe in." Caleb nodded again, showing no sign of retreat, and followed the ranch hand toward the guest quarters, unaware that Eleanor remained standing on the veranda long after he disappeared, her eyes fixed on the dark shape of the stallion pacing beneath the fading light. Night settled over the Voss ranch like a blanket woven from silence and distant thunder. Caleb sat on the wooden porch of the guest cabin, listening to the restless movements of horses across the fields. He could hear Midnight Tyrant clearly, the heavy rhythm of hooves striking earth echoing through the darkness like a heartbeat too large for its cage. Caleb closed his eyes, letting the sound guide his thoughts, and memories returned uninvited. Memories of another ranch, another stallion, and another promise he had once failed to keep. He rose slowly and walked toward the paddock, moving with the careful patience of someone who understood that fear traveled faster than footsteps. The stallion noticed him immediately, snorting and pawing the ground as Caleb approached the fence. Moonlight spilled across the animal's powerful frame, highlighting the tension coiled beneath his skin. Caleb leaned against the wooden rail, saying nothing at first, allowing the horse to study him just as he studied the horse. Minutes passed in stillness before Caleb spoke softly, his voice barely louder than the whisper of wind across the plains. "You lost someone too, didn't you?" The stallion's ears flicked forward, and though he continued pacing, his movements slowed slightly, curiosity mingling with suspicion. Caleb remained where he stood, refusing to reach out, refusing to force connection where trust had not yet grown. Unbeknownst to him, Eleanor watched from the shadows of the barn, her hands clasped tightly as she observed the strange interaction unfolding before her. She had seen men shout at Midnight Tyrant, challenge him, threaten him, and attempt to dominate him with brute strength. She had never seen anyone simply speak to him as though he were capable of understanding. Something about Caleb's quiet persistence unsettled her carefully constructed walls. She remembered the night her husband had attempted to break the stallion, the sound of shattering wood, the scream that had ended in silence, and the crushing realization that grief could harden into vengeance if left unchecked. Watching Caleb now, she felt a tremor of doubt she had not allowed herself in years. Caleb eventually stepped away from the fence, sensing he had pushed the moment as far as it could go. He turned toward the cabin, unaware of Eleanor's hidden presence, and disappeared into the darkness. The widow remained still long after he left, her gaze fixed on Midnight Tyrant, who had stopped pacing entirely and now stood facing the direction Caleb had gone. For the first time since her husband's death, the stallion was quiet beneath the moonlight, and the ranch itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for dawn to decide whether the stranger would become another broken name in Eleanor's growing legend, or something far more dangerous, a man capable of changing everything she had built from her sorrow. Dawn arrived over the Voss ranch like a blade of gold slicing through layers of cold gray mist, and the entire property seemed to awaken with a tense anticipation that hung heavier than the morning dew. Ranch hands gathered near the paddock long before the sun cleared the canyon ridge, whispering among themselves as they prepared ropes, saddles, and medical supplies that had become routine for every attempt at riding Midnight Tyrant. Word had already spread to Red Hollow during the night, and several townsfolk had ridden out at first light. eager to witness whether the quiet stranger would meet the same fate as the 25 before him. Eleanor Voss stood beside the fence dressed once again in black, her posture rigid and composed, though her eyes betrayed a restless flicker that she struggled to hide beneath layers of practiced indifference. She told herself she was only there to maintain tradition, to observe another inevitable failure, yet something within her tightened each time she glanced toward the guest cabin, where Caleb Rourke had spent the night. When Caleb finally emerged, the murmurs faded into uneasy silence. He walked with calm deliberation, his boots brushing softly against the dirt as though he carried no burden of expectation. His weathered coat had been removed, revealing a simple shirt rolled at the sleeves, and he carried no rope, no whip, and no visible tools of control. This alone stirred uneasy glances among the ranch hands, who had seen seasoned riders arrive armed with every method known to tame wild horses, only to be thrown violently within seconds. Caleb paused beside Eleanor, removing his hat in silent greeting, and for a moment the rising sun illuminated both figures like opposing symbols, her draped in morning shadow, him outlined in the fragile light of uncertain hope. "You understand the rules," Eleanor said, her voice measured but sharper than she intended. "You mount him alone. You stay on for 1 full minute. If you fall, the challenge ends." Caleb nodded once, his gaze drifting toward Midnight Tyrant, who had already begun circling the paddock like a gathering storm sensing disruption. The stallion's muscles rippled beneath his midnight, black coat, and each stomp of his hooves sent small clouds of dust spiraling upward as though the earth itself resisted his fury. Caleb stepped closer to the gate, but instead of rushing forward, he rested his hand lightly against the wood, watching the horse with focused stillness that felt almost reverent. Eleanor studied him carefully, searching for signs of arrogance or fear, but she found neither. Instead, she noticed something far more unsettling: patience. It was the same quiet patience she had witnessed the night before when Caleb stood beneath the moon speaking softly to the stallion. She pushed the memory aside as she signaled for the gate to be opened. The heavy latch creaked loudly as it swung outward, releasing an invisible tension that spread through the gathered crowd. Caleb stepped into the paddock alone, the gate slamming shut behind him with a finality that echoed across the ranch like the closing note of a funeral bell. Midnight Tyrant reacted instantly, rearing high with a furious shriek that sent several spectators stumbling backward. His hooves sliced the air, and when they crashed back to the ground, he charged toward Caleb with terrifying speed. Gasps erupted from the crowd, but Caleb did not run or raise his arms defensively. Instead, he turned slightly sideways, lowering his gaze and stepping aside at the last possible moment, allowing the stallion to thunder past him. The move was so precise it felt less like evasion and more like acknowledgement. The stallion skidded to a halt several yards away, spinning sharply to face him again, nostrils flaring with violent confusion. Caleb remained motionless, his presence steady and unyielding like a lone tree rooted against a desert storm. Minutes passed as horse and man circled one another, neither committing to attack nor retreat. Caleb spoke occasionally in low murmurs too soft for the crowd to hear, but something in his tone seemed to ripple through the stallion's agitation. Eleanor found herself gripping the fence rail tightly, her knuckles pale against the wood as unfamiliar tension coiled within her chest. She had seen countless riders attempt to dominate Midnight Tyrant through force, yet Caleb approached him as though negotiating with an equal adversary. It disturbed her, not because she feared failure, but because a fragile part of her wondered what success might mean. The standoff stretched longer than any previous attempt, transforming the paddock into a silent battlefield, where time itself seemed hesitant to move forward. Caleb took one cautious step toward Midnight Tyrant, then another, each movement deliberate and measured. The stallion responded with snorts of warning, his ears flattening briefly before lifting again in wary curiosity. Caleb extended his hand slowly, not reaching for the horse but offering his palm in open invitation. The gesture was so subtle it might have gone unnoticed by the crowd, yet the stallion's pacing faltered slightly as he studied the outstretched hand. Dust swirled lazily around them as the rising sun warmed the earth, casting long shadows that merged and separated like uncertain destinies being rewritten. Eleanor's breath caught when Midnight Tyrant stepped forward instead of retreating. The movement was small, barely more than a shift of weight, but it shattered years of certainty she had built around the horse's untamable rage. Caleb did not react outwardly, he simply maintained his position, his voice continuing its quiet rhythm like a distant melody guiding the stallion closer. When Midnight Tyrant finally lowered his massive head enough for Caleb's fingers to brush against his mane, a collective gasp rippled through the onlookers. The contact lasted only seconds before the stallion jerked away, rearing violently as if shocked by his own vulnerability. He bucked and spun across the paddock, fury reigniting in explosive bursts of power. Caleb remained steady, waiting for the storm to pass rather than chasing it. Eleanor's pulse pounded painfully as she watched, memories colliding within her mind, her husband's determined shouts, the crack of splintering fence rails, the terrifying stillness that followed his fall beneath Midnight Tyrant's hooves. She forced herself to remain composed, reminding herself that this stranger would meet the same end. Yet the conviction felt weaker with each passing moment. After several minutes, the stallion's wild bursts slowed into heavy, exhausted breaths. Caleb moved forward again, his steps synchronized with the animal's fading aggression. This time, when he touched the horse's mane, he slid his hand gently along the thick strands, whispering words carried away by the wind. Midnight Tyrant trembled beneath the contact, muscles tightening as though preparing to explode once more, but he remained still. Caleb seized the fragile opportunity. Placing his foot carefully into the stirrup of a loosely hanging saddle the ranch hands had managed to secure earlier during the chaos. The entire paddock held its breath as he lifted himself onto the stallion's back in one smooth motion that carried no force, only balance. The reaction was immediate and violent. Midnight Tyrant erupted into a frenzy of bucking power, launching himself into the air with bone-shattering ferocity. Caleb clung tightly, his movements flowing with the horse rather than resisting him. Each leap felt like an earthquake beneath him, yet he adjusted with instinctive precision, gripping with his knees and leaning with the rhythm of the animal's rage. The crowd counted silently, their hearts pounding with each passing second. Eleanor's vision blurred as she tracked Caleb's form rising and falling against the morning sky, her mind screaming warnings she refused to voice aloud. 30 seconds passed, then 40. Midnight Tyrant twisted violently, attempting to throw Caleb sideways, but the cowboy anticipated the move, shifting his weight seamlessly. Dust clouds engulfed them as the stallion galloped in frantic circles, his energy burning away in desperate surges. Eleanor realized she was counting under her breath, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain detached. When the minute mark approached, the stallion's bucking slowed into uneven jolts, his breaths ragged with exhaustion and confusion. Caleb leaned forward slightly, resting his hand against the horse's neck as though grounding both of them in shared survival. The moment the minute passed, silence fell across the paddock with the weight of a collapsing world. Caleb remained seated atop Midnight Tyrant, who now stood trembling but still beneath him, his head lowered slightly as if burdened by emotions too complex for instinct alone. The crowd erupted into stunned murmurs that quickly grew into shouts of disbelief, but Caleb did not celebrate or raise his arms in triumph. Instead, he gently slid from the stallion's back, landing softly in the dirt before stepping beside the horse rather than away from him. Midnight Tyrant watched him carefully, his ears flicking forward in uncertain recognition as Caleb rested his palm against the animal's neck in a quiet gesture of respect. Eleanor felt her knees weaken as realization crashed through her defenses. The challenge she had built as a fortress around her grief had been conquered, not through dominance, but through understanding. She stepped forward slowly, her black dress trailing across the dust as the crowd parted instinctively to allow her passage. When she reached the paddock gate, she paused, studying the man who had accomplished what 25 others could not. Caleb removed his hat once more, his expression calm but shadowed by an emotion she could not immediately identify. "You've won," Eleanor said, though the words felt foreign in her mouth. Caleb shook his head gently. "I didn't come to win," he replied quietly. "I came because I know what it's like to lose something you don't know how to let go of." The statement struck her harder than any declaration of victory could have. She stared at him, searching for deception, but found only raw sincerity that mirrored her own hidden wounds. The crowd faded into distant noise as Eleanor stepped into the paddock, her gaze shifting toward Midnight Tyrant, who stood unusually calm beside Caleb. Memories surged through her mind, her husband's laughter, the tragic night that shattered her world, the years spent feeding her sorrow through impossible challenges. She reached out hesitantly, her hand trembling as she touched the stallion's mane for the first time since her husband's death. Midnight Tyrant flinched but did not pull away, his dark eyes reflecting something softer than fury. Tears welled in Eleanor's eyes, though she refused to let them fall. "I thought if someone could tame him," she whispered, "would prove my husband's death meant something greater than my failure to stop him." Caleb studied her quietly before answering. "Sometimes meaning isn't found in conquering pain," he said. "Sometimes it's found in learning how to live beside it." The wind swept across the paddock, carrying the scent of dust and wild grass as Eleanor lowered her head, her carefully constructed armor finally cracking beneath the weight of truth. The ranch, the challenge, and the legend of Midnight Tyrant had all been born from her refusal to confront her grief. Standing beside Caleb and the once untamable Stallion, she realized that the lonely cowboy, who arrived without fanfare, had given her something far more valuable than victory. He had shown her the possibility of healing. As the sun climbed higher over the canyon, bathing the ranch in brilliant gold, Red Hollow witnessed the end of a legend and the fragile beginning of another. Caleb prepared to leave quietly, believing his purpose had been fulfilled, but Eleanor called after him before he reached the gate. Her voice carried a new strength, softer but far more powerful than the iron command she once wielded. "Stay," she said simply. Caleb paused, glancing back at her, at the Stallion standing peacefully beside her, and at the ranch that now shimmered with possibilities neither of them had dared imagine. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of his loneliness ease slightly, replaced by a cautious hope that frightened him more than any wild horse ever could. The wind stirred between them, carrying the promise of a future neither could fully see yet. Both were suddenly willing to face together.